Picture this. It's the dead of winter, somewhere in what is now Ukraine, around 15,000 years ago. The wind isn't just cold, it's the kind of cold that makes the inside of your nose hurt the second you breathe in. The kind that turns exposed skin numb within minutes. There's no wood for miles around because the trees gave up on this place a long time ago, retreating south where the climate still tolerated them. And yet, a group of ancient humans is alive, fed, and somehow not freezing to death. Living inside a dome built almost entirely out of mammoth bones. Skulls stacked like bricks, deliberately arranged. Tusks curved overhead like ribs holding up an improvised sky. Animal hides stretched tight across the gaps to block the worst of the wind. No metal tools involved anywhere in the process. No nails, no blueprints scratched into anything. Just a group of people who looked at one enormous dead animal and collectively decided, this is now our house. That's not a fantasy detail pulled from a movie set. That's an actual documented archaeological site, and it's just the warm-up, pun absolutely intended, for how unbelievably resourceful, strange, and occasionally borderline insane ancient human survival methods actually got. Because today we're working through the craziest ways ancient humans clawed out a living in a world that was actively, constantly trying to kill them, and by the end of this, you're going to look at your modern camping gear and feel a little embarrassed about complaining over a leaky tent. Let's set the stage properly first, because the context here genuinely matters. Ancient humans were not living in some kind of permanent tropical paradise with ripe fruit conveniently falling into their open mouths. Enormous stretches of human history played out during ice ages, in landscapes that swung violently between brutal winters and unpredictable, resource-scarce summers. There was no agriculture yet to fall back on, no stored grain reserves, no backup grocery store 3 blocks away if a hunt failed badly. Every single day functioned as a fresh renegotiation with a planet that did not care, even slightly, whether you personally lived or died. And under that kind of relentless, unforgiving pressure, the human brain did exactly what it does best under stress. It got creative, fast, and sometimes a little terrifying in the process. Let's go back to that bone house for a moment, because it genuinely deserves more attention than a quick mention. Sites like Mezhirich in Ukraine show dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth bones, skulls used as foundational blocks stacked with surprising structural logic, long bones and tusks used as supporting beams, the whole framework wrapped in hides to seal out wind and driving snow. Building a structure out of an animal's own skeleton sounds almost disrespectful until you actually run the math behind it. A single mammoth could provide literal tons of meat, an enormous reserve of fat for fuel and food, hide for clothing and shelter material, and then, once the soft tissue was gone, the bones themselves simply became architecture. Nothing was wasted because nothing could realistically afford to be wasted in that environment. This wasn't decoration or showmanship. This was an ancient supply chain in action, and the mammoth functioned as basically a one-stop hardware store that also happened to double as dinner for weeks. And speaking of dinner doubling as critical supplies, let's talk about fat, because ancient humans had an almost obsessive, borderline scientific relationship with animal fat that modern diet culture would have a complete meltdown over. In cold environments, lean meat alone can actually become dangerous to survive on for extended stretches of time, a condition sometimes informally nicknamed rabbit starvation, where a body fed almost nothing but lean protein, with no fat or carbohydrates mixed in, gradually starts breaking down from the inside, regardless of how much food is actually being consumed. Ancient humans living through harsh winters appear to have understood this on some deeply intuitive level, consistently prioritizing fatty tissue, bone marrow, and organ meat over plain lean muscle whenever they had the choice available. Bones weren't simply discarded after a meal and forgotten, they were deliberately cracked open, often with surprising precision and consistent technique, specifically to extract the marrow hidden inside, which is basically a calorie-dense energy bar concealed inside a drumstick. Ancient humans were essentially running their own version of applied nutritional science, just without lab coats, peer review, or published journals. Learned the hard way, generation after painful generation, sometimes at a brutal and irreversible cost. Now let's talk about fire, because if you think fire is a boring, obvious topic, you have severely underestimated how much ancient survival depended on it, and just how shockingly tricky it actually is to create from absolute scratch. We treat fire like a given today because we've got lighters in our pockets and stoves in our kitchens and apps that quietly control our thermostats from across the house. Ancient humans had to coax fire into existence using friction, sparks struck from specific stones, and an almost ridiculous, hard-earned amount of patience built through repeated failure. And once they actually had it reliably going, they didn't just use it for warmth and basic cooking. Fire was used to harden the tips of wooden spears, making them noticeably more durable for hunting. It was used to deliberately clear land, manage local ecosystems, and encourage the kind of plant regrowth that reliably attracted prey animals back to a usable area. Which means ancient humans weren't just passively reacting to their environment as it came at them. They were actively engineering it, thousands of years before anyone coined a fancy term like ecosystem management. There's also some genuinely wild evidence suggesting ancient humans physically carried fire with them on the move, literally transporting glowing embers over real distances, nursing them along carefully in protective containers or smoldering bundled material, because starting a brand new fire completely from scratch was often so labor-intensive and uncertain that keeping an existing flame alive was simply the smarter, safer survival bet. Imagine being personally responsible for keeping a single ember alive for days at a time, through wind, through rain, through long stretches of travel, knowing full well that if it died out, your entire group might not reliably get warm again for a long, dangerous stretch afterward. That's not just a chore on somebody's daily list. That's a job with stakes most modern employees would absolutely refuse to tolerate for a single shift. Let's shift over to clothing now, because this is where ancient survival starts sounding less like raw, brute toughness and more like genuinely impressive, deliberate engineering. You cannot survive an Ice Age winter with bare skin and good intentions alone, no matter how tough you think you are. Ancient humans developed sewing needles carved from bone, with eyes narrow enough to thread sinew through cleanly, dating back tens of thousands of years before anything resembling modern textiles existed. That single detail matters far more than it sounds like it should, because tailored, fitted clothing, actual layered garments shaped deliberately to the body, rather than just loosely draped hides thrown over the shoulders, represented a massive technological leap forward. Loosely draped fur keeps you somewhat warm, sure. Fitted layered clothing with minimal gaps for wind to sneak through is the actual difference between surviving a brutal winter season and quietly becoming a grim statistic by midwinter. Some researchers studying clothing lice specifically, yes, lice, stick with me here, this gets surprisingly clever, have used genetic divergence between human head lice and human body lice to estimate roughly when ancient humans started wearing clothing regularly, since body lice specifically adapted over time to live inside fabric rather than directly on exposed skin. It's a strange, slightly stomach-turning piece of evidence on paper, but it's a genuinely clever one, using a parasite's own evolutionary timeline as an accidental, built-in historical record of human clothing habits. Now, here's a survival method that sounds almost too clever and too coordinated to actually be real. Ancient humans appear to have used controlled fire alongside tight group coordination to deliberately drive entire herds of animals toward cliffs, specifically engineered as mass hunting events. Sites associated with mass bison kills, for example, show clear evidence of dozens of animals driven off a single edge at once, providing an enormous, if temporary, surplus of meat, fat, and hide from one. Extremely risky, extremely coordinated event. This wasn't a single lone hunter creeping up slowly with one spear and a lot of hope. This was choreography. Multiple people working in tight sync, using fire, noise, and the terrain itself as a weapon, effectively turning the landscape into a trap built from timing alone. It required real communication, careful planning, and deep trust between every participant, because if your timing was even slightly off, you didn't just lose the hunt for the day, you potentially lost a person standing in the wrong spot when a herd of panicked multi-ton animals decided to bolt somewhere nobody had predicted. And while we're already on the topic of terrifyingly risky survival tactics, let's talk about something almost nobody brings up in polite conversation. Ancient humans appear to have occasionally eaten each other, not as some horror movie plot twist thrown in for shock value, but as a documented, if genuinely rare, survival behavior under extreme famine conditions, with cut marks found on certain ancient bones that are consistent with deliberate butchery patterns rather than animal scavenging after the fact. I want to be careful and precise here, because this almost certainly was not common, casual, or culturally normalized behavior in most groups across most of history. It shows up specifically as a desperate, absolute last resort response tied directly to extreme starvation, not a regular dietary choice anyone made lightly, but it's a brutal, sobering reminder of just how thin the line really was between survival and total collapse for ancient groups. When every other available option runs out completely, biology has a documented way of overriding comfort and taboo alike. And ancient humans, like every other species on this planet pushed under extreme enough pressure, were not somehow exempt from that grim calculus. Let's lighten the mood slightly, because not every single survival method here is grim and heavy. Some of them are just delightfully, almost mischievously strange. Take ancient humans' relationship with poison, for instance. Specifically, the deliberate, careful application of toxic plant and animal compounds onto the tips of weapons to make hunting dramatically more efficient. Evidence from southern Africa suggests ancient humans were applying poison derived from certain beetle larvae or specific plant extracts onto arrow and spear tips tens of thousands of years ago, turning even a relatively minor wound into a reliably lethal one. Think about the sheer amount of trial and error that must have been required to even figure that out in the first place. Somebody at some point in deep ancient history had to notice that a particular plant or insect caused serious illness or death. Remember that detail accurately, deliberately test it on purpose, and then pass that incredibly dangerous knowledge down precisely enough that it didn't simply kill the hunter by accident the very first time it was tried. That's not luck stumbled into by chance. That's generations of careful, genuinely deadly experimentation, refined slowly over time. Speaking of deadly experimentation, let's talk about something every single ancient human had to deal with constantly, day after day. Figuring out which plants would feed you and which ones would kill you in a world with absolutely no labels, no internet to quickly check, and no friendly podcast warning you ahead of time about toxic berries hiding in plain sight. This ongoing process, sometimes informally called sampling by researchers today, almost certainly cost real lives along the way. Someone at some point in deep ancient history ate the wrong root, the wrong mushroom, the wrong unfamiliar leaf, and didn't survive long enough afterward to warn anyone else directly. But their reaction, their sudden illness, their death became information regardless, passed down carefully, remembered deliberately, turned slowly into rules, taboos, and oral traditions about which plants were safe near which specific seasons, which berries looked dangerously similar to genuinely deadly ones, which roots needed to be processed a very specific way first to neutralize their natural toxins. Cassava, for example, a staple food plant relied upon in some regions throughout much of human history, is mildly to severely toxic if not processed correctly before eating. And yet ancient and traditional peoples figured out multi-step preparation methods over time, soaking, fermenting, careful cooking, to make a genuinely dangerous plant safely, reliably edible. Nobody handed them a chemistry textbook explaining exactly why any of that worked. They just knew through repeated trial, painful error, and probably more than a few funerals along the way, that skipping the process entirely meant skipping survival entirely too. Let's talk shelter again for a moment, because bone houses certainly aren't the only wildly creative ancient solution to the universal problem of "I need to not die outside tonight." Ancient humans living in regions with consistently deep snow appear to have used the snow itself as functional insulation, understanding, almost certainly through pure observed experience rather than any kind of formal physics education, that snow, despite obviously being cold to the touch, actually traps pockets of air and can genuinely help maintain a more stable internal temperature inside a shelter, similar in basic principle to how modern igloos still function today. Meanwhile, in completely different environments elsewhere, ancient humans dug partially underground shelters instead, deliberately taking advantage of the Earth's natural insulating properties to stay noticeably warmer during winter and cooler during summer, essentially inventing an ancient, dirt-based version of basic climate control thousands of years before anyone ever plugged in an air conditioner or a furnace. There's also the matter of water, which gets dramatically less attention in most survival conversations than fire or food, despite being just as completely non-negotiable for staying alive. Ancient humans had to develop an intuitive, highly detailed mental map of water sources spread across huge stretches of territory, carefully tracking seasonal changes, knowing exactly which water sources reliably dried up, which ones froze completely solid in winter, which ones became dangerously contaminated at certain predictable times of year. In some particularly arid regions, evidence suggests ancient humans dug specifically to access groundwater hidden below the surface, or closely followed animal behavior patterns to locate hidden, less obvious water sources, essentially using the entire surrounding ecosystem as a kind of survival instruction manual written in footprint footprints, plant growth patterns, and seasonal animal migration, rather than in words on a page. Now here's a detail that genuinely surprises most people the first time they hear it. Ancient humans appear to have practiced a real form of medical intervention that goes well beyond simply letting injuries heal naturally on their own without help. There's clear skeletal evidence of healed fractures that were deliberately set and stabilized by someone, amputations that healed cleanly enough afterward to suggest deliberate, careful post-injury care rather than just fortunate accidental survival, and even possible evidence of trepanation, deliberately drilling or carefully scraping a hole directly into the skull, for reasons that are still actively debated among researchers today, ranging anywhere from treating serious head injuries to addressing seizures to, frankly, some purposes we may genuinely never fully understand. The fact that some trepanation patients show clear, healthy bone regrowth around the hole afterward means they survived the procedure itself, sometimes for years afterward. That is an unbelievably high-stakes gamble performed using nothing but stone tools, no real anesthesia beyond whatever herbal remedies might have existed at the time, and absolutely zero margin for a careless error. Let's bring things back to something a little more relatable. Clever, deceptively low-tech inventions that solved enormous life-threatening problems with disarmingly simple solutions. The spear thrower, sometimes called an atlatl, is a perfect example of this. A relatively simple, stick-based lever device that dramatically increased the speed, range, and overall force of a thrown spear, turning hunters from short-range risk-takers into hunters who could reliably strike from a much safer distance away. It's not flashy. It's basically just a stick with a hook carved into the end. But that simple stick with a hook fundamentally changed the underlying math of survival, meaningfully reducing the danger involved in close-range hunting while simultaneously increasing the odds of a successful, cleanly lethal throw. Sometimes the actual difference between life and death isn't some grand, sweeping technological leap forward. Sometimes it's just a really good stick designed correctly. And let's not forget social survival, because this particular one rarely gets enough credit despite arguably being the single most important survival method on this entire list. Ancient humans survived primarily because they were almost never truly, completely alone for extended stretches of time. Group living meant consistently shared food, shared childcare responsibilities, shared warmth on cold nights, shared accumulated knowledge, and a reliable built-in safety net for the sick, the injured, or the elderly within the group. There's solid skeletal evidence of ancient humans who survived for years afterward with serious physical disabilities, injuries or conditions that would have made hunting or gathering for themselves essentially impossible on their own, which strongly suggests that other group members were actively caring for them, deliberately sharing food, providing ongoing protection, keeping them alive long after pure individual physical capability would have otherwise run out completely. Survival of the fittest gets misquoted constantly in casual everyday conversation, usually to imply ruthless individual competition above all else, but the actual ancient human survival data tells a noticeably different story. Survival of the most cooperative, more often than not, reliably won out over survival of the most physically dominant individual. Let's also talk about something that sounds almost silly at first until you really think it through seriously. Storytelling functioning as a literal, practical survival tool, passing down detailed, genuinely memorable narratives about which plants were dangerous, which rivers flooded unpredictably, which animals were deceptively aggressive despite looking calm, wasn't just casual entertainment passed around a fire to kill time. It was an ancient data storage and transmission system using emotional engagement and memorable narrative structure to reliably encode critical survival information in a form that could be passed down accurately across many generations without any form of writing involved at all. A scary story about a relative who died after eating a specific berry is, functionally speaking, a piece of genuinely life-saving data wrapped carefully in narrative packaging specifically designed to be remembered and retold accurately decades later. Ancient humans were, in a very real and practical sense, running their own version of an oral internet, with stories functioning as the search engine results for things in this world that will kill you. Now let's circle all the way back to where we started, that mammoth bone dome standing firm in the middle of a brutal ancient winter, because it actually ties every single one of these survival methods together quite neatly. That structure wasn't just a simple shelter thrown together out of necessity, it was the accumulated end result of careful fire management, cooperative group hunting, detailed working knowledge of animal anatomy, fat and basic nutrition science, clothing technology advanced enough to survive the cold required to even build it in the first first place, and social cooperation extensive enough to coordinate dozens of people moving tons of heavy bone material into one stable, functioning structure. Nothing about that dwelling was the product of a single, lucky invention or a stroke of isolated genius. It was the accumulated result of thousands of years of trial, painful error, occasional death, careful observation, and a stubborn human refusal to simply accept that the environment had already won the fight. And that, honestly, might be the single most impressive survival method of all, when you really step back and look at it. The sheer, almost irrational refusal of ancient humans to just give up and die quietly when the planet handed them genuinely impossible conditions to work with. No metal tools to rely on, no written instructions passed down, no emergency services to call, just patient observation, shared memory, tight cooperation, and an absolutely staggering, almost stubborn amount of creative problem-solving passed down carefully, generation after generation, slowly turning a fragile, hairless primate with no claws and no natural armor into a species fully capable of building houses out of mammoths and surviving ice ages that completely wiped out animals 20 times their own size. So next time your Wi-Fi goes out for 20 minutes and it somehow feels like the absolute end of the world, just remember there were ancient humans out there literally building furniture-grade architecture out of dead megafauna, performing skull surgery using nothing but sharpened rocks, and domesticating fire using nothing more than friction, patience, and pure spite directed squarely at the cold. We've genuinely got it shockingly easy by comparison, and somehow we still manage to complain more about far less.